do it. But here's the thing, though. A lot of people just didn't care that much because you know what? Don't worry. The war will be over by Christmas. Yeah, so let's talk about the onset of World War I real fast. What were the emotions of the people entering in World War I from these European countries? They were excited. They were amped, ready to go. They wanted to fight this war. They leapt willingly into it. And they thought the war was going to be over in a few months because of all the wars that had come before it. Franco-Prussian War, boom, over in a matter of about 9 months. The Second Schleswig War, boom, over in about 2 months. The Austro-Prussian War, boom, over in 7 weeks. So a lot of these newly militarized, heavily industrialized European countries thought that this war was going to go off really quickly and that it was going to give this generation of young men the chance to prove themselves to their countries and their new national identity and really show up and be manly men and super masculine. And even women bought into it too. They were like, oh, these men are going off to fight for the fatherland and we're so excited for them. Good for them. Yay, hooray, hooray. A lot of people believe that this also has to do with the concept of slightly faltering masculinity during the 20th century period of European economics. Because look at these young women right here. There is a good to solid chance that those young women were working during the early 20th century in before World War I. During the Industrial Revolution, they started incorporating women into jobs inside of factories and things like that. So a lot of European historians argue that the masculinity of men had been hyper-affected by this because traditional gender roles had been shattered. A lot of y'all missed that question on the quiz. Gender roles were very, very changed and very, very messed up. Not messed up like wrong, but changed heavily from the 1800s into the 1900s because women began entering the workforce, having less children by choice, like a lot of other different crazy stuff's going on. Women began to grow in their autonomy. Many of them were demanding the right to vote. So it was destroying this idea of what it means to be a man in 20th century Europe. So a lot of these men are excited to go off and fight in a war because they think that's going to reclaim their masculinity. Now, this is a theory. That's a theory. That's revisionist history. But it makes a lot of sense. And look at these guys. This right here are German troops on their way to the front lines. And look at the playful writing on the side of the train car. Ausflug nach Paris means literally trip to Paris, or we're going on a trip to Paris. This is during the Schlieffen Plan, that they're heading into Paris to take it over real quick. And then I have no idea. I can't decipher what this says right here. But this literally says, fight me on the, and I just don't know what it is. And then right here, Auf Wiedersehen auf dem Boulevard. That literally means like, goodbye on the boulevard, right? Like, so now I don't know what boulevard means, but literally they're saying they're heading to France like they're going on a trip. They're going on a trip to just fight off some, to just fight some people. And oh, I don't know, murder. You ever think about that with war? This is murder. Like, you're actually killing another person. It's ridiculous. And that person has a family and friends and a life, and then it's just like, out, over, extinguished in the shadow of a doubt. Now, this is also going to be a new kind of war, though. War is going to drastically change. Remember what I said earlier? These people are going off to fight this war right now because they're like, yeah, it's going to be over by Christmas. It's only going to take like 6 months and we'll be done. They could not be any more wrong. It's absolutely ridiculous. World War I is going to be wildly different because let's take a second to talk about what war was like before World War I. War before World War I, you got different kinds of looking soldiers. You've got different battle tactics. I'm throwing some pictures up right here showing you some pictures of Napoleonic era wars and the Franco-Prussian wars. And as you can tell, the wars were very different. You, for the Napoleonic Wars, fought your entire war using single-shot muskets that would only fire one shot per every single time you pulled that trigger. And like you would have to reload it. And the best in the world could fire 2 shots per minute. Now, you also look at their uniforms. Look how bright and colorful and intense their uniforms are that they're wearing. This is going to change dramatically as well. We'll get to that here in a little bit, but look how bright and intense their uniforms are, showing their national pride because they want to be visible on the battlefield, showing that they know who is who and who's on their side and that they can easily find and take down the enemy because it's such close combat. It's in your face. Literally the combat's like right here. So as you can tell, oh, also, what are you riding into triumphant glory on during the wars that came before World War I? Oh, I don't know. A horse. I mean, like cavalry units were majorly still a factor before World War I. Not anymore, though. Not anymore. The Industrial Revolution and the militarization of countries in 20th century Europe is going to affect that. And World War I is going to be dominated mostly on the Western Front by a concept known as trench warfare, when opposing sides are going to sit in these ditches or trenches and attack each other across a big expanse of land in the middle. So you would have a trench, and this area in the middle known as no man's land. So trench line right here, no man's land here in the middle. And no man's land was covered in tons of obstacles, like barbed wire and down planes, dead bodies, that was a huge one, barbed wire and barbed wire and barbed wire. Oh, did I mention barbed wire? So barbed wire is going to be one of the biggest defense mechanisms in this entire thing, which we'll get to here in a second when we talk about the trench lines and stuff. Now, but why, though? Why? Why are we digging trenches? Why are we doing this to each other? Mainly due to one massive invention, the Maxim Machine Gun. The machine gun is going to be the thing that pushes trench warfare. Because remember, how many rounds can a machine gun fire? 600 rounds per minute. A machine gun firing 600 rounds per minute, that means letting off 10 shots a second, means theoretically speaking, you could be killing 600 people per minute. Right? And the firing rate of these devices made it so the only way to avoid them was to get beneath the line of fire. And how do you do that? You dig in. Digging in is what it's known as. Now, I'm not going to talk about the specific battles that make this happen like I do in my honors classes, but they ended up having to dig in because when the Schlieffen plan failed, and they failed to get all the way into France and all the way around the back side of them, the Germans had to retreat at one point, and when they retreated, they literally dug in. They took their trenches out, and they started digging. And a second ago, I said, well, how come they don't just flank them on the other side? They tried to do that at one point. They kept trying to go, and then they would just dig their trench line further. And then this side would try to go, and then they would dig their trench line further. And so it ended up just growing and growing and growing. Write this down really quick. The Western Front trench would end up being 440 miles long. That's going to be a fill-in-the-blank question on your test. 440 miles of trench on the Western Front. 440 miles. Now, in your mind, you think the trench system looks like this. You think World War I looks like this. Because in the back of your mind, you're like, it's probably taking place in a barren area, away from people, big desert. I see rocks, and I see a straight line, and I see men walking in a straight line. Wrong. This is a picture from World War II. This is an inaccurate representation of trench warfare. Notice that you've got modern tanks, first of all, that are the dead giveaway, but also this trench is made mainly just to move people, not to fight out of. This is what trench warfare looked like. They were taking place in the countryside of France, in the countryside of Poland and Russia, and what is modern-day Ukraine on the Eastern Front. And it's what used to be farm fields. And they were digging these trenches, and we'll get to that here in a second. But as you can tell, these trenches were constructed in farm fields up in northern France. And as you can see, it's not in these barren territories like the picture I just showed you. It's in areas where people were actually heavily populated during certain times of the year. And it was areas where farmers used to actually use to produce food, actually function in their economy. And we're going to just kind of go ahead and breeze through, breeze through a couple of other different segments and pictures of the trenches, just so you can kind of understand and get a feeling for exactly what it looked like in these wars. This right here is another picture of a trench. See, it's actually heavily fortified. This is a British trench, actually. You can tell by the shape of their helmets. and they're looking out over what is known as no man's land out in front of them. Now, this right here is a borderline archaic looking picture because look at what these guys are riding. Horses. And the very first modern war. Look at what he's wearing. You don't realize this, but it would have been a bright colored outfit at the time, wearing a feathery cap trying to show his socioeconomic level above the regular foot soldier because he's a cavalryman. Look, the craziest thing about it is, other than the fact of like with these uniforms and stuff like that, which, started out like being super, super brightly colored like they did in the Napoleonic era. This guy is kind of emblematic of that. He would have been wearing super bright colors like the picture here. As you can see, over time, the uniforms evolved to start kind of creating this modern frame of warfare. No more bright red pants and blue jacket and stuff like that. No, camouflage colors. Blend in with your surroundings, because now it's not the same as fighting face to face with somebody anymore, because this war actually in 1914 started on horses and ended in those bad boys, tanks. And as you can see, look at the uniforms they're wearing now towards the end of the war. That's a British Mark I tank that has apparently gotten stuck in a trench. And this war shaped the dynamic of how wars following it would be fought. This war changed everything about war, from the clothes to how you fought it to how you defended yourself from fully automatic weapons. And so trench warfare, of course, is going to be kind of this like bombastic, scary, grizzled war where it's going to be like, what do we do to stay away from these machine guns? I guess just get below the gunfire. So as you can see, it's a very intense thing, and men had to live in these things. Live, sleep, eat inside of their trenches. This right here is another British trench, again, as you can see with the helmets. And it's a very, very tough life for these guys, all brought on by this invention, the Maxim Machine Gun. Well, technically not Maxim Machine Gun. That's a Vickers gun. It's actually the British version of a machine gun. And it's also just the same kind of thing, though. Water jacket on the outside, fully automatic. That one fires probably anywhere from 600 to 700 rounds per minute because they kept getting better and better as they went. The current ones today, I think, can fire somewhere in like 1,200 rounds per minute, like anti-miniguns and things like that. So all this trench warfare stuff brought on by that. Now, looking at another map of Europe, as you can see, this is what we started with. And this is what we're going to end up with. A Western Front trench, again, that's 440 miles long, and an Eastern Front that's going to be 3 times to 2 times the size of the Western Front, because it's going to be massive. It's going to go from Poland all the way down through Eastern Russia and Western Russia, Eastern Germany, and go all the way around Austria-Hungary and into what is modern-day Ukraine, and then down into the Ottoman Empire. It's absolutely huge. And we don't know how long the Eastern Front was, because it wasn't as solidified as the Western Front. The Western Front was immovable, and we'll talk about that here in a minute when we talk about the Stalemate. But the Eastern Front was not as home to as much intense trench warfare. It was at home to a lot more scorched earth techniques, like full-on military engagements, fluid lines that would actually charge forward, get pushed back, things like that. It fluctuated a lot. Now, trench warfare was big in the West, but the reason why it wasn't as big in the East is mainly just because it's too expansive. The area is just too big. And I'll show you another map here in a second that kind of demonstrates that a little bit further. And at sometimes it was just too cold. Like the Eastern Front was dominated by like very hard winters. As we all know, Napoleon figured that out. Don't ever try to invade Russia on land. Guess who else figured that out? Hitler figured that out. Don't try to invade Russia on land. The cold winter will destroy your army, no questions asked. And it doesn't care either. It's going to do it without relent. The Ottoman powers are going to join the Central Powers in October of 1914 and begin their heavy involvement in it as well. And the Ottoman Empire being down here, okay? The Ottoman Empire is made up of the former Ottoman Empire and what is mostly modern-day Turkey, okay? The Ottoman Empire used to be massive. It used to be the biggest thing you could ever even think about. Absolutely huge. It used to expand all the way through North Africa, all the way up into the Balkan states up here, all the way into the modern day Middle East, and then all the way over to the east as far as Pakistan in certain time periods. So the Ottoman Empire, why are you just now getting involved, guys? Why is the Ottoman Empire coming into this war now when you're a failing state? mainly just to defend some trade routes, particularly this area right here, known as the Dardanelles, and to keep their grip over the Middle East the best they can as their empire continues to wither and die. Now, of course, the Allies are going to involve themselves on that front as well. Sir Lawrence of Arabia is a very cool proponent and a very cool figure, but I don't have time to talk about all that stuff right now. But as you can see, look at how big the Eastern Front is. Look, all this right here is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. That's going to end the involvement for the Russians. But look where it started, right here on this red dotted line. And it's going to be pushed all the way back. Look how long that red dotted line is compared to this blue one right here, right? Very different dynamic, very different size, because the Western Front is going to be that dominated trench warfare, whereas the Eastern Front is not going to be fought in the same way. But the Western Front and the Eastern Front are going to both find themselves in one of these, a stalemate, which is also known as a deadlock, which neither side is really winning, okay? So a stalemate is kind of like these two enemies are just bombarding into each other constantly, just banging into each other relentlessly, and no one's really getting anywhere. No trenches are being moved backwards, really, and if you're moving forward or gaining territory like yards at a time. Yards, like 9 to 10 feet at a time. It's like a big success. You're only moving forward like barely. And a lot of it has to do with the dynamic of how trench warfare is fought. Because let's think about this for a second. What do these trenches look like? What do the fronts look like? Well, they're immovable, first of all. Look at this diagram of a trench. This is a trench like as if it was cut down the middle, so you can kind of get a look at what it actually looks like. Look at this trench right here. It is wood-sided, more than likely going to be a German trench, because the German trenches were much better well made. We'll talk about that again here in a little bit. But look at the wooden boards, the step-up area. This thing would have been anywhere from 6 to 8 feet deep, and it's very well constructed. And to make it immovable, if you were to hypothetically gain access to your enemy's trench, it is a matter of time until the 440 miles long of reinforcements and the rest of them are going to come and oust you, kill you, and throw you out into no man's land as well. Because it's not a movable line. It's not like, oh, Red Rover, we're just going to push them backwards. No, they are literally dug in. And as you can see, they're very, very hard to take. Because think about it. You've got sandbag walls preventing you from being able to get up and over and also defending from water. You've got wire tangle. Oh, wait, barbed wire? Have we brought up barbed wire lately? So we got barbed wire that is actually going to prevent guys from getting close to your wire entanglement. And also not to mention the fact that you have a machine gun nest behind your trench that's going to shoot over top if somebody's actually trying to storm into your trench. These things are not going to be very easy to move. Also, they're sophisticated. It's not just a trench, it's an entire trench network. As you can see, there are multiple lines of trenches. It's like a spider web more than it is just a front line. So look at the trench first of all. Look how it's built in this zigzag-like formation. There is a reason behind that. The reason why it's built in a formation like that is because it offers more defense to the men inside the trenches as well. This is very important. You will need to know this. This is a multiple-choice question on your test. If, hypothetically, I was in this trench over here, and I stormed through no man's land, got through all this barbed wire, and into my enemy's trench, and I had a machine gun with me, and I can just spray shots down the length of the trench, if the trench was straight, that'd be awesome for me, because nobody's going to come take me. But this trench bends every few yards and goes into corners. That way, the people that are trying to come take you out, all they have to do is hide behind this little area, and they're completely protected. If a grenade finds its way into the trench, they go behind this little area, boom, they're protected. So it's actually much more like a zigzag than it is a straight line. And then you had communication trenches that branched off of it, because you can't just if this is the ground level and the trench is down here, you can't just run up and then jump in the trench. You're going to get shot while you're above ground. So they had trenches that actually were dug to lead up to it, almost like a hallway in a sense. Then they had support trenches behind it where they would keep supplies and reserve troops. And then the big one in the back, the artillery battery, which is going to be one of the most important weapons that we actually talk about in this entire war scape, due to the fact that it cost the most amount of lives and it was believed by the generals to be the most important weapon in this entire war, the artillery gun. And we'll talk about it in more depth a little bit later and kind of give you a picture of what it is, what it looks like, stuff like that. This is another great diagram of what the trenches look like. If you want to go back and take some screenshots of that stuff and throw it into your notes, that is completely fine. I highly recommend it. This one right here is a very in-depth, very detailed outlook on the trench diagrams themselves. As you can see, it's an entire trench network. There's our artillery battery in the back, reserve trench, support trench. You've got machine guns that can fire over top of them into no man's land. And look how sophisticated they would be. Some German trenches would even have dugouts underground that had running water and electricity ran to them, sometimes 15 meters below the ground, which is absolutely wild. So going forward, though, this is another one. Look, it's a trench network. It's not just simple lines like these red ones. It's a network. This right here is a real-life picture. This right here is taken from an observation balloon towards the end of the war. Now, as you can see, this war left permanent scars all over Europe. And it's a very intense thing. This is actually taken from several hundred feet up, and you can actually see the trenches themselves and how no man's land bends and twists all over the Western Front. And how in some areas, you could be as far as 100 yards from each other, or you could be anywhere from 300 to 500 yards away from each other. No man's land really didn't have a standard width. It kind of like expanded and grew and like snaked its way all the way down the Western Front. Now, the craziest thing, though, is some of you are thinking, like, wow, those are some really intense scars on the European terrain. I wonder if I could ever go to northern France and ever actually see these trenches firsthand. You actually can't. They actually filled them in as soon as the war was over. Mainly because, you know, this is French farmland. People need to get back to work, and they need to farm, they need to provide for their countries. But also, you want to bury anything that you thought is going to relate back to this war. Because in the back of your mind, you're thinking to yourself, oh, it's going to be over by Christmas. It ain't over by Christmas. This war scarred Europe, both emotionally, physically, as well as mentally. And then looking at this entire schematic, when they were digging and filling all these things back in so that life could continue after the war was over, they left a lot of stuff out there. A lot of unexploded artillery shells, a lot of unexploded mines, and a lot of dangerous weapons were left out there. So if you, to this day in northern France, have to call, the French Foreign Ministry to send a tractor out to your house to dig into the dirt to make sure you don't blow yourself up on accident, just in case. Like if you wanted to dig a field and make a garden, you got to call them up and be like, hey, want to come check for artillery shells for me, please, that are over 100 years old. Now this war is resulting in just a lot of death and a lot of destruction and a lot of really, really intense things. So going further, though, what do you do? What do you do in this situation? How do you attack in a stalemated war? Well, the best tactics that people thought that they could come up with during this time period, let's go ahead and scrunch that up a little bit, was to try and go back to the old Napoleonic tactics and try to hybridize those with this new industrial era warfare that is going to be creeping up on the bulk of Europe. So really, though, what's going to be sad is like territory is going to be gained and lost at like little tiny yards at a time, like just a very small amount. Now, some that argue that, oh, well, the Battle of the Somme gained the British over a mile. Yeah, that was one battle that cost $1 million, like, that resulted in over 500,000 dead. So, like, let's not, like, be happy about that at all, and even in a little bit. But we'll talk about that here in a few minutes. So, territory was gained and lost at yards at a time. The human cost is absolutely catastrophic. Bombardments is going to be the big way that the generals try to take this new type of industrial war and try to figure out how to use it better. So they figure out that they decide they're going to use a new weapon at their disposal known as artillery. So artillery is going to claim the most lives in World War I. And what artillery are these guys right here in the corner of this slide. So those right there are artillery guns. Artillery guns fire huge shells that look like gigantic bullets, upwards of anywhere from, several, like 1,000 feet away, upwards of even further to over a mile away. The largest out of all of them was known as Big Bertha, and it was a German gun, and it could fire a shell over a mile with decent accuracy. Crazy enough, though, Big Bertha was named, in German, it's Dick Bertha, and it was named after the guy who built its wife, which I don't really know if she wanted to have a gun named after her. But that's just me. I think my wife would be pretty upset if I did that. But these weapons right here are going to be the thing that costs the most lives. Throwing up a little bit of footage for you so you can see what it looks like. They would cause massive explosions on the front lines, and they would try to lob them from one end to the other. Remember when we talked about the diagrams of the trenches and everything, and we took a little look at what those trench lines looked like and how it was a sophisticated network, not just something super, super simple and super just like a ditch? Well, look, that's the artillery barrages back there. So they would have multiple of those big artillery guns in the back behind the several layers of trench, and they would lob those shells up and into the enemy areas of the enemy trenches, hoping to detonate because when they hit the ground, they would detonate, hoping to explode and kill the enemy. Now, following a lot of these artillery bombardments, many soldiers would be ordered to go over the top. Now, over the top is when you would charge out into no man's land. I'm going to go ahead and throw a little bit of footage of that up right here as well. As you can see, it is very, very traumatic. And then just to give you a heads up, this footage is kind of sad because this is real footage from World War I, and you are actually actively seeing people fight a war and literally kill each other. So it's a very, very costly strategy. Now, the over-the-top is just basically the way that some generals like Ludendorff and Haig and others amongst them, Sir John French, believed that a charge was still going to be the way that you won a war. That's a Napoleonic tactic, a pre-Napoleonic tactic, a very old tactic in general, to charge at your enemy in a full frontal assault in the hopes that you will break their lines in half and then you can outflank them on the outsides. Now, the problem with trench warfare, though, is even if an over-the-top assault is very effective and you happen to push all the way into the forward trenches, now what? They're just going to dig a new trench forever how far you push them back. It's just going to keep having to be pushed backwards. So as you can see, this is how they believe they were going to fight that war, and it's going to be very, very traumatic and cost a ton of lives. Because to break the stalemate, human cost is going to be absolutely gigantic. To break these stalemates, both sides, the Central and the Allied powers, are going to begin to attack very, very aggressively. They're going to use artillery bombardments and aggressive charges like we just talked about with the over-the-top maneuvers. This is crazy, right? This is absolutely insane. Why would you do these things? Some of the biggest battles on record in World War I that we won't get into depth with, we're just going to kind of bring them up a little bit, are battles like the Battle of the Somme, which over 1 million people were killed or wounded. Casualties, over 1 million casualties, actually close to 1.5 million casualties are going to be resulted from the Great Battle of the Somme. It's going to be considered one of the most successful British offenses in the entire war. And some argue it was General Douglas Haig, the guy that came up with it, a butcher, or was he a hero? I go with butcher, because why did we ever need to kill 1.5 million people in a futile assault that you know full well is not going to actually end this war? Because that happened in 1916. The war kept going until 1918. Which I actually, as a historian, believe that the reason why Germany ended up losing the war had a lot more to do with blockades and hunger strikes, which we'll get into here in a second. So Verdun, France is going to be another huge one. 500,000 were going to be killed or missing. Third Battle of Ypres, also known as Passchendaele, is going to see 500,000 casualties. Many of those men are going to drown in mud. I'll show you a picture of the Passchendaele battle scene here in a second, but that is absolutely crazy that the environmental conditions of this trench warfare is going to see guys drowning to death in mud because they're being forced to charge into no man's land after months of rain. So Second Battle of Ypres is going to be another huge one. Thousands are going to be dead from poisonous gas attacks, which I'll show you a picture of here as well. That right there is a scene from the Battle of the Somme. That is a British Mark I tank, because the very first time tanks were ever debuted in World War I was actually at the Battle of the Somme, about a year and a half into the war. So now these things are very, very big, goofy, and clunky, but like I said, one of you is going to end up making, or a few of you is going to end up making, a informational poster on the tanks of World War I, which is a lot of fun because the weaponry is actually something really neat to study, even though it's super morbid and scary. That's another tank right there. That's a male tank, just so you know. They're male and female tanks. I'll leave it up to the people doing the posters to figure that out. This right here is another big evidence of artillery bombardments. This right here is the city of Passchendaele in France. Passchendaele is going to be the place where a lot of these men end up drowning in the mud, as seen right here, as they try to drag several artillery guns through it. Look how bad this mud is. So anyway, that is Passchendaele before the beginning of the Passchendaele battlefront, and this is what it looked like afterward. These are two aerial photos, one taken before, one taken after. This one taken before shows a small town, a small village with several other main roadways, main ways to get around, and also several houses and buildings. But then after the war is over, it is going to be reduced to nothing but craters, which is absolutely disgustingly savage. Now, granted, not many civilians were there at the time of those bombardments. However, it's still people's homes, businesses, and livelihoods that have been destroyed. And that's kind of an example of the civilian cost of this war. So going forward, this right here is a scene of a poisonous gas attack issued by the Allies on the Germans. Poisonous gas happens to be one of the most horrific weapons that ever debuted during this war. Like I said, we're going to leave it up to some of our other students to actually create some informational posters that you can actually see these things on, but poison gas happens to be a really crazy one because it oftentimes does not kill you immediately. Some gases, like phosgene gas, could kill you 48 hours later. Mustard gas actually even could cause you to drown to death in your own blood, but would for sure cause immediate blindness, which is a very terrifying thing. So gas is going to be another major one. Due to World War I, gas is now outlawed in war. Gas attacks are illegal and a human rights violation to use in wartime. Also, blockades are as well due to World War I. So World War I is going to be so savage that the world decides to come together and decide that they need to make rules of warfare. That is absolutely crazy. This is a man standing out in the no man's land of Passchendaele. No man's land, remember, is the area between the trenches, right? The big area that they're trying to storm over the top of. As you can see right here, this is another image from Verdun, France. Verdun used to be surrounded in woods. This is what those woods looked like after World War I was over. Absolutely savage, just gigantic amount of carnage. Now, neither side is going to win an advantage after any of these battles, which is absolutely devastatingly awful to even think about. But this was becoming not a war of military mindedness and strategy. It is becoming a war of attrition. Go ahead and circle attrition. Star it, highlight it, underline it, whatever you got to do. This war is becoming focused on starving out or forcing the other side to quit when their supplies run out. So this battle, this world war, is not going to be won on the front line trenches. It is probably going to be won when the people at home and the civilians have endured so much stress, starvation, disease, and discomfort that they are going to demand that their country surrenders. So as you can see, this war is absolutely wild. It's very, very messed up. It's very screwed up, and it's turning into this thing, a war of attrition, when you run out of supplies, so you have to quit. So going forward, though, here is the new technologies that are going to make this war much, much deadlier. So as the Industrial Revolution, we know, provided a huge amount of economic resources as well as technological resources for the European continent post-1850, it's also going to lead to the efficient production of new types of warfare technology, including, but not limited to, machine guns, artillery shells, grenades, poison gas, tanks, airplanes, submarines, Unterseeboots, zeppelins, messenger dogs, and even messenger pigeons as well. So go ahead and take a second to pause me real fast and write down this list because I don't want you to get bogged down in time.